Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and then there were Mormons. Yeah! Okay, guys, have fun. Okay, so I finally finished reading through Gouldie's commemoration address for Alexander Dallas Backy, and thankfully he spends like the last quarter of it or so summarizing and blowing smoke up Alexander Dallas Backy's butt, right? So now I can get to some of the stories that I haven't covered yet. But before I do that, I think I found a really interesting side story that I'd like to tell. So let's take a little break from Alexander Dallas Backy for a little while, shall we? And let's talk a little bit about the time that the Mormons decided to jump their way into Mud City, right? They came in out of nowhere, right? They have me jumping at shadows, right? The story's really amazing. And so that story starts with the death of the first superintendent of the Coast Survey. And unbelievably, there are some dissenting voices in the choice of Alexander Backy to succeed him. Right? And so Gouldie here, he describes the scene. Right? At the time of Hassler's death, I quote the language of a distinguished officer of that period, and I think it's interesting that he doesn't name the officer. Right? The condition of the Coast Survey was anomalous and Ishmaelitish. It's like Ishmaelitish. Call me Ishmael. What does Ishmaelitish mean? So I wanted to look up Ishmael because I really, other than the Moby Dick reference, I don't know anything about Ishmael. And so it says that he was the first son of Abraham, right? And that the Muslims venerated him as a prophet and that he lived to be 137 years old, right? So he had a nice long life, right? And so according to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, right, Ishmael is considered the ancestor of the Ishmaelites, the Hagarenes, or the Arabians. He's the patriarch of the Kedar. Right? According to Muslim tradition, Ishmael thereby founded a great nation as promised by God in the Old Testament, and was buried with his mother Hagar next to the Kaaba in Mecca under the area demarcated by the semicircular Haji Ishmael wall. And so that has to be this area here, which I think is amazing because, of course, if you remember, the line from Fort McHenry goes right to this side of the Kaaba cube. I mean, that is really unbelievable that Ishmael would be buried here and that Gould would call the state of the Coast Survey Ishmaelitish. And so I can't really get into Ishmael and all of that too much, but I do think I figured out why he called it that, and that's because it says that God told Hagar that her son would live in conflict with his relatives. And so that's what's going on here, right? There's conflict in the government and among the scientific societies as to who should be the next superintendent. And of course, that does eventually fall to Backy, but that has to be why he's calling it Ishmaelitish, because every man's hand was against his neighbor, right? And so among these dissenting voices was the Honorable John C. Spencer, who was Secretary of the Treasury at the time and the real head of the survey. The principal assistants reported directly to him and not to Hassler. It says that Hassler was really kind of only in charge of whatever field expedition he may have been on or whatever. So I was like, okay, who is John C. Spencer, the real head of the survey? And so as stated, he was the 16th Secretary of the Treasury, but he was also the 17th Secretary of War. And so I think this is interesting in a number of ways. The first is that, as the 17th Secretary of War, he served in this office before he was treasurer, of which he was the 16th. So that tells me that there were more secretaries of war in the U.S. government than there were secretaries of treasury in his time, right? But also, again, sort of strengthening that tie between the Coast Survey and the scientific communities and the military by being Secretary of the War during this period. You have to believe that he was very involved then as well. And of course, before he had these titles, he led a very distinguished career, which at one point had him in 1826, had him as a special prosecutor for the state of New York, who was sent to investigate the disappearance of this man, one William Morgan, right? And William Morgan, he looks like a smart guy, right? I'm not going to make that joke here, but, it turns out that maybe he actually wasn't all that smart. Looks being deceiving because he runs afoul of these guys. That's right, the Freemasons, right? Because what William Morgan does is he starts shooting his mouth off that he's written a book called The Illustrations of Masonry, in which he reveals all the insider secrets of Masonry. He's going to give away all of their rituals and stuff. Right? And so this is not a good idea. I don't see how it's ever a good idea, right? But this is what he's decided to do. And this really ticks off the Masons, of course, because he's one of them. And so what this suggests to me, of course, is that he's breaking kayfabe. And so if you're unfamiliar with what kayfabe is, it's essentially the imaginary world that professional wrestlers inhabit when they're in character, right? It's the illusion that separates their profession from amateur-style collegiate wrestling. And so now it's not as important as it used to be, but at one time it was professional suicide to break from character or to openly talk about trade secrets. That was breaking kayfabe, and that's what this reminds me of. William Morgan is about to break kayfabe, and the Masons don't like it. But the thing about this story is how much of an insider was he? So let's talk a little bit about William Morgan here, right? And so the gatekeeper narrative from Wikipedia doesn't paint a very flattering picture of him. He's born in Virginia, and he never really is all that successful. He kind of bounces around from jobs, and when he's in his mid-40s, he gets married to this woman, Lucinda Pendleton, right? And this is in October of 1819, making her some 25 years his junior. But maybe not too much to look at there because, it's kind of common in these stories, right? And so they have 2 children, and they move to York, Upper Canada, which is Toronto today. And so he opens a brewery in York, Toronto, right? And his business is destroyed by a fire. So look at these 2 tropes we have hanging out here. We got the brewery and the fire together, and Morgan is reduced to poverty. The poverty trope. I mean, that's a trifecta right there, right? That's a triangle, right? And so after this devastation, they return to the United States and settle first in Rochester. And now Rochester is a very interesting place, it's turning out. And someday I'm going to have to dig deep into Rochester, but that won't be today. Right? And so he starts there, and then he moves to this place called Batavia, where he begins work as a bricklayer and stonecutter. Right? So who makes William Morgan a star? They do. Right? But it's here. And so it's during this period that local histories describe Morgan as a heavy drinker and gambler, again sort of underscoring that earlier part of his life where he's very unsuccessful, right? He doesn't really achieve much of anything. But this characterization is disputed by Morgan's friends and supporters because, of course, right? He wasn't like that at all. Right? He was an honest man, right? But because he claims to have been made a master mason while he was in Canada. Right? And he appears briefly to have attended a lodge in Rochester. And in 1825, he receives the Royal Arch degree at Leroy's Western Star number 30. Oh my God. Leroy's Western Star chapter number 33. The Western Star and number 33. And Leroy is just a town kind of outside of Rochester, so another lodge there. Right? He declares under oath that he had previously received the 6 degrees that preceded the Royal Arch degree, though it has never been established if he actually received these degrees, and if so, from which lodge. All right, so essentially what he did was he lied his way in to the Freemasons. Right? And once he was inside, he wasn't all that well liked, of course, because he appeared to them, as the narrative states, he was a braggart and a drunkard and a gambler, and he didn't really fit well with those Masons in Leroy or Rochester or wherever, right? And so they rebuke him, right? And shunned, that's when he starts to blow his mouth off about this book that he's going to write. And he declares openly that a local newspaper publisher, this David Cade Miller, had given him a sizable advance for the work, and that he was promised 1/4 of the profits from the financial backers of the venture, who was this newspaper publisher here, his landlord, John Davids, and this Russell Dyer, right? And they enter into a $500,000 penal bond with Morgan to guarantee its publication. And now a penal bond is a guaranteed contract, right? And so $500,000 in 1826 is like $14 million. It's something like $13.8 million. That is a phenomenal sum of money for any book. Like Dan Brown and Stephen King at the height of his powers, he never got $14 million for a single book. I'm sure of it. I mean, that is a lot of money, right? And who would put this much money up for a book written by a guy who's a known liar, right? The lodges disavow him. Somehow he has conned his way into this bond. And you would certainly think it was a bad idea once this happened, right? It says that on September 11th, 1826, Morgan was arrested for a supposed non-payment of a loan and allegedly stealing a shirt and tie, and was put in debtor's prison. And so the newspaper publisher had to come bail him out. But once he was bailed out, he was rearrested immediately for failing to pay a $2 tavern bill.
$2 cash.
Right? And so now this is really unbelievable. So when they say that when the jailer was away, a group of men convinced his wife to release Morgan, and they walked to a waiting carriage, which arrived 2 days later at Fort Niagara. Shortly afterwards, Morgan disappeared, never to be seen again. Right? And so, I didn't look it up, but I'd bet dollars to donuts that Fort Niagara is a star fort. And so his disappearance creates quite a sensation in New York and in the country, really. And of course, as I said, it was investigated by John C. Spencer here. And in his investigations, there are several Masons arrested, tried, and convicted for his kidnapping, of course, because there's a lot of wanting to take credit for Morgan's disappearance. A lot of these Masonic organizations were, sort of bragging about how it was them that did it, right? But since there was no body, there could be no murder charges or anything like that. And so most of these Masons who are arrested and tried and convicted, they get to skate. They walk after just short jail terms, right? But what's really interesting about this story is the aftermath of it. And that's that there's this massive anti-Masonic movement that's created around this, or if not around this, certainly spurred on by this. Like this was the nexus point, ground zero for the anti-Masonic movement, right? And which gains enough momentum to run a presidential candidate on an anti-Masonic ticket. I mean, they lose, of course, and shortly afterward, the anti-Masonic movement kind of peters out, but the damage has been done. And to me, what this kind of suggests in the narrative is this is where we start to see that turn in the narrative of sort of villainizing the Freemasons, right? And creating that dichotomy within the order, on purpose, maybe that it serves some purpose to somehow create this anti-Masonic movement and to start all of this up, and that perhaps William Morgan was a pawn in this game. And this is a story that needs much deeper work, because it's not even the story that I want to tell, really. The story I want to tell is the story of his wife, Lucinda Pendleton. At least I think this is her story anyway. We're going to find out as we go here, because it's in the Wikipedia gatekeeping narrative that the story took a sharp left turn out of nowhere. And so let me show you what I mean. And so this is the William Morgan wiki page that I've been pulling all my quotes from. And here they're talking about that anti-Masonic movement and how they were able to field a presidential candidate and then how the party dies down. And so that's where this paragraph kind of winds up. But then in the very next paragraph, it says this: members of Freemasonry criticized the Mormons for their adoption of Masonic rituals and regalia. Like, what? The Mormons, they've had nothing to do with the story. What is going on here? So it says that in 1830, Morgan's widow, Lucinda Pendleton Morgan, married George W. Harris of Batavia, right? A silversmith who was 20 years older, right? So clearly she has a thing for older men, right? And it says, after they moved to the Midwest, they became Mormons. Okay, so, she had to move on. She marries the older guy. They move away, become Mormons, What does that have to do with the Freemasons being angry with the Mormons for stealing their Masonic rituals and regalia? Except, of course, we now know who her first husband was, right, who wrote that book. So maybe there's something here, right? Because not only does she go on to the Mormons, right? By 1837, some historians believe that Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris has become one of the plural wives of Joseph Smith, founder of the Latter-day Saint movement. So not only does she join the Mormons, she marries the leader, right? Though she continues to live with her husband, a common practice apparently. But what may be not so common is that after Smith was murdered, and I don't know if I'm going to talk about that at all, she was sealed to him for eternity in a rite of the church. Sealed for eternity. Joseph Smith's wife forever in the afterlife, right? That's what sealing is, right? It's an ordinance performed in Latter-day Saint temples by a person holding the sealing authority. The purpose of this ordinance is to seal familial relationships, making it possible the existence of family relationships throughout eternity. So how is it that this twice widowed young maiden becomes the eternal wife of Joseph Smith Jr., right? First president of the Church of Christ, the Mormons? This is really unbelievable. And there has to be more to this story, right? Especially, of course, because this is contested by Joseph Smith's legitimate wife. In a biography on Emma Smith, his legitimate wife. It says that she witnessed several marriages of Joseph Smith to plural wives, though that throughout her lifetime she publicly denied her husband's involvement in the practice of polygamy and denied on her deathbed that the practice ever occurred. No such thing as polygamy or spiritual wifery was taught, publicly or privately, before my husband's death, that I have now or ever had any knowledge of. He had no other wife but me, nor did he to my knowledge ever have. And so now, of course, this could just be seen as a wife being dutiful, covering up for her husband because that's the politically correct thing to do in the day, I guess, maybe. Who knows, but she denies this. Yet I found this in a website dedicated to Joseph Smith. It says that Lucinda Harris and her husband George Harris joined the Church of the Latter-day Saints during the fall of 1834. Right? The missionary Orson Pratt records in his journal, "At Terre Haute, I preached a few times and baptized George W. Harris and his wife." And I think it's interesting that Terre Haute keeps poking its way in here, right? It was in the Pfizer episode, I believe, right? And I got it wrong about Larry Bird. That's where he went to college. He was actually from French Lick, Indiana. And so they've made their way from Batavia to Indiana, right? And the following year, they moved to Missouri to gather in Zion with the rest of the saints, right? So that would be 1835. And so I think it's interesting that the Mormon mission appears to be creating Zion in America. But even more interesting is that it says that Joseph Smith doesn't make his way out to Missouri, to Zion, until 1838, some 3 years after the Harrises. And so it says that Joseph and his wife Emma are met upon their entry into Missouri by George Harris here, and that he's received into their home. And they stay there for 2 months in 1838. And it goes on to say that the date of the marriage between Joseph and Lucinda is uncertain, though a friend of Lucinda's indicates that the wedding happened when Joseph Smith was staying with them in Missouri, and that after marrying Joseph, Lucinda continued to live with George, as we talked about, typical. But this is really crazy because it says that it is uncertain if Lucinda's first husband, George, was aware of the marriage. Well, wait a minute. So this would indicate that Lucinda's first husband was alive when she got married to Joseph Smith and that his name was George. But I'm thinking that these historians just either aren't aware that she was married before, or they're trying to forget that she was married before because we know her first husband was William Morgan. And so, of course, this got my fat sense tingling even more than it already was. And I wanted to dig a little deeper into the relationship of Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, right? And her marriage to Joseph Smith. Could it just be like a coincidental thing, or could there be more to it? And how much more to it could there be? And so it's time to talk a little bit about Joseph Smith Jr. here, right? And as I said, I cannot get into this too in depth. It's way too big a story, and who knows, maybe someday I'll tackle it in full. But for right now, we're just going to do some quick hits. Right, and it says that he was born on December 23rd, 1805, in Vermont. Right, he was one of 11 children, and when he was 7, he had a crippling bone infection, and after surgery used crutches for 3 years. Right, but an ill-fated business venture and 3 successive years of crop failures, culminating in the 1816 year without a summer. Again, something else that needs to be brought into the story at some point. The Smith family left Vermont and moved to Western New York. And though while I must have known this because I did read a book that goes into the Mormon history quite a bit about 25 years ago or so, my memory transferred Joseph Smith to upstate New York. If you were to ask me yesterday or the day before, where was Joseph Smith from, I would have said upstate New York, right? But it isn't. It's Western New York, where they took out a mortgage on a 100-acre farm in the townships of Palmyra and Manchester. And so that's kind of interesting. It's one farm in 2 townships. But anyway, this area is unbelievably close to where the Morgans settle when they come back from Canada. All right, William Morgan and his wife Lucinda, they settle first in Rochester and then to Batavia, right? They're very close anyway, right? But then when you see where Joseph Smith moved to from Vermont, look how close Palmyra is to Rochester, right? That's really unbelievable. And Manchester as well. And so on first glance, it might be so what? But when you actually do a little research, you find out that the 1820s in this area of Western New York was a religious hotbed of weird sects and offshoot cults just springing up everywhere. As I said, it was a hotbed of religious activity at the time. And so under those circumstances, in the 1820s, it doesn't seem all that far-fetched that Joseph Smith Jr. would have run into Lucinda Morgan. And let's face it, Joseph Smith Jr., he's a hell of a lot more attractive than William Morgan, right? So perhaps it's not beyond the realm of reason that this very handsome and charismatic man, with his charm, beguiled William Morgan's young wife, right? And that they were involved in a relationship before the disappearance of William Morgan, right, in the 1820s in Palmyra or Batavia or something like that, right? Especially when you factor in this, right? Don't forget about that $500,000 penal bond, which was guaranteed to Morgan upon the publication of his book. And now the thing about it is that the book was published after his disappearance, right? And so as a penal bond, a legal contract financially backed to the tune of $500,000, which again, as I said, is $14 million today, that contract would have to be paid out. And that payout, I assume, would go to his next of kin. Right now, of course, I don't know this, right? It doesn't say that in the gatekeeper's narrative there. It just, so I have no idea of knowing what happened to that $500,000. But the fact that the Freemasons get so angry with the Mormons for stealing their traditions and their regalia, and that potentially this woman could have received $500,000, and though William Morgan's disappearance is never solved, when looking for motive in these types of things, there's motive enough in the fact that her husband wrote this tell-all book about the Freemasons which was used to really stoke this anti-Masonic sentiment and get that rolling. I mean, there's motive in that, right? Because it must have been very important to get that anti-Masonic ticket up for somebody, right? But I think there's more motive in perhaps inheriting $500,000 and stealing the secrets of the Freemason for yourselves, right? And maybe starting your own religion using them. Who knows? I don't know. $500,000 sounds like an awful lot of seed money. But I think this is a really amazing story. And of course, one that deserves way better than me. But while looking into the history of Joseph Smith, I did find another very interesting thing. And that's when I was looking at where he moved to from Vermont in Palmyra, New York. Right? Palmyra was named after present-day Palmyra in Syria. Right? And so, here's Palmyra in Syria. Right? And there's ruins there. Right? And it says that, Palmyra is an ancient Semitic city in present-day Homs Governorate, Syria. Archaeological finds date back to the Neolithic period, right? And documents first mention the city in the early 2nd millennium BC. Right? And it changes hands between all of these empires before becoming a subject of the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. The city grew wealthy from trade caravans. The Palmyrines became known as merchants who established colonies along the Silk Road and operated throughout the Roman Empire. Palmyra's wealth enabled the construction of monumental projects such as the Colonnade and the Temple of Bel. Right? There it is. And what is the Temple of Bel? Of course, it's the Temple of Baal. Right? And so the city where Joseph Smith comes of age and where he starts his Mormon church out of is named after this village in Syria that has a temple to Baal. You're kidding me, right? And of course, this gets even more interesting because it says that according to later accounts, Smith was visited by an angel named who? Moroni. Look at that suffix, Roni. Just like Lazzaroni and everything that meant there. How is this a coincidence? Right? And so that this Moroni reveals the location of a buried book of golden plates, which is the prophecy of the Mormons, right? As well as other artifacts, including a breastplate and a set of interpreters composed of 2 seer stones set in a frame, which had been hidden in a hill near his home. I think this little story here is one that really needs good treatment. Right? And, but I decided to let it go. I decided to put it in my back pocket and save it. And I continued with my reading and my research into Alexander Backy and until I finished the speech, right? And at the end of it, Gould publishes a bibliography of Backy. And so this is an article that Alexander Backy published in May of 1843. And it's an account of observations at Philadelphia and Toronto during the magnetic disturbance of May 6, 1843. What I needed to do was find out more about this disturbance, I had the article, right? Could I find the article? And I found it in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society, Volume 3, 1843 to 1846. And it says that the disturbance was first noticed at Philadelphia between 3 and 4 p.m., 9 and 10 p.m. Guten Jin time, where observations at term day intervals were commenced. Now, I was like, Guten Jin time? What is that? But I kind of let it go. I kept reading, And it said that a similar disturbance was perceived at Toronto, Canada, where the instruments were observed at the term day intervals from about 10 p.m. Guten Jin time. And I was like, what is happening? What is going on with this Guten Jin time? I need to find out what this means, right? 10 p.m. Guten Jin time, we know, according to this, is 6 hours ahead of East Coast time, right? So 10 p.m. Guten Jin time is 4 p.m. Eastern time. So the same disturbance that happens on May 6th in Philadelphia happened the day before on May 5th in Toronto. What did either of these two places have to do with Guten Jin? Right? So I had to look up Guten Jin. All right, so Guten Jin is a city located in central Germany, and I love this 1585 woodcut of it, right? They show a fortified city with a moat. And perhaps with some of these angles, it could be one of those wonky star fort looking fortifications. And so I don't know if this moat is a river, but that is where we tend to find these star forts, isn't it? One thing that I noticed right away is that its location here, I said, I know where that is. That's Westphalia, right? And sure enough, in 1807, the city was turned over to the newly created Napoleonic Kingdom of Westphalia. Westphalia being an extension of the Bonaparte Empire, and we know that reaches into Baltimore and the Bonaparte's role in the late 19th and early 20th century politics as Secretary of War and whatnot. It's absolutely incredible. Check out the Bonaparte episode if you'd like to learn more about that, right? But so I thought that was absolutely incredible. Right? And then it said this. And so the first thing that Wiki really tells me about Guten Jin here is that it shouldn't be confused with this Guten Jin, right? But also that if I'm looking for the village of Guten Jin in eastern Baden-Württemberg, I should see Guten Jin Langenau. And I was like, wait a minute, what? Baden-Württemberg, that's where Charlie Pfizer is from. So now, could this be the Guten Jin whose time is so important that Backy and these other magnetic observers, they need to notate the Guten Jin time in because of that connection? I don't think so, but let's continue on with Guten Jin. And of course, Guten Jin, and so Guten Jin essentially means to live by the stream. And so we have that stream metaphor rotating back in, like with Alexander Backy and Bacharachus and, the Irish river gods and all the stream metaphors. It's just ridiculous the way rivers and streams flow through this story, right? And so I wanted to see what else I could find out about Guten Jin. And it turns out that it was nearly untouched by Allied bombing during World War II. So that makes Guten Jin architecturally a very attractive place, right? And as a matter of fact, it's a very young city these days. Most of the inhabitants of Guten Jin are under 50 years old. It's a big college town, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I think this is really interesting that it was untouched by Allied bombing during World War II when I read this. And that's that the Jews settled in Guten Jin in the late 13th century. On March 1st, 1289, the Duke gave the city council permission to allow the first Jew, Moses, right? How is it that Moses is the first Jew, right, to settle inside the town limits? And remember, March 1st may actually be the new year, depending on which calendar Guten Jin is running under. The subsequent Jewish population lived predominantly close to St. James Church. And I think that's interesting. That's a Catholic church, that the Jews would live so close to the Catholics here. But what really is interesting to me about this is how it relates to a story of Bacharachus I did not share in that episode about Alexander Backy and the history of the Backy name. And that story revolves around the Werner Kapelle, right, which is still an unfinished Gothic ruin today. And it's the namesake of Werner Oberwessel. Right, so this is it back here, I guess, in this engraving. Right, it says, Werner was known in connection with pogroms triggered by his death. According to the Christian blood libel, which was typical of the times, a 16-year-old Werner was murdered on Maundy Thursday, 1287, by members of the local Jewish community, who then used his blood for Passover observances. And I was like, that's crazy. Is this what Jews were doing in the 13th century? I mean, this is unbelievable, right? And on the grounds of this alleged ritual murder, there arose an anti-Semitic mob who waged a pogrom, wiping out Jewish communities in the Middle and Lower Rhine and the Moselle regions. It says that in folk Christianity, the cult of Werner, which was only stricken from the Bishopric of Trier calendar in 1963. So this thing lasted for a long time, right? And so I wanted to know what a pogrom was. I hadn't really heard that word before. And so what a pogrom is, it's an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group, in particular that of Jewish people in Russia or Eastern Europe. The Nazis began a pogrom against a Jewish people in Germany. And so now, I mean, this is really amazing because it just sort of underscores how this is the story of the Hebrew faith. I mean, they keep pissing people off and getting persecuted out of places or running from places and having to go from place to place until they find their chosen land, which of course they actually had to kick people out of through the act of war. It's just really unbelievable. And that, it's crazy the way the narrative actually puts this in there. I'm not putting this in there. I'm not placing any judgment on Jewish people or anything like that. The narrative is doing that. That's pointing to these connections all on its own. And I can only just show what I see. And so now I don't think it's a coincidence that there is this Jewish settlement there and that this was spared by Allied bombing during World War II, if for no other reason that today Guten Jin is noted for its production of optical and precision engineered machinery, and that it's the seat of the light microscopy division of Carl Zeiss. And now this is really important in tying into that Master of Reality series I was doing, and and how that was all working towards glass and the things that could be done with glass. And so if Guten Jin is a hub for glass making at any time, it would definitely be a protected thing, right? And today it's the main site of Sartorius AG, which specializes in biotechnology and measurement equipment. I wonder what biological material this technology is measuring, right? And the region around Guten Jin advertises itself as the Measurement Valley. And of course, that's amazing because who was the king of measurements, right? Alexander Dallas Backy was, right? And they call this Measurement Valley, perhaps even tying in further to the metric system and who knows what else of all these measurements. I don't know. And so it's here in Measurement Valley that I believe I solved the riddle of Guten Jin time, right? And that's, as I mentioned, Guten Jin has a major university that's been around since the mid-1700s or so. And I think it's pretty interesting that the Brothers Grimm went there, right? But at this time during the 1800s or so, the professors there were some of the most famous mathematicians in history. And the first they list is Carl Friedrich Gauss. And of course, I think it's interesting, Carl Friedrich, also the first name of Pfizer, right? And the story really wants to make Carl Gauss here like the preeminent magnetism guy, right? And he creates these devices to help measure magnetism, which of course Backy improves upon, of course he does, right? But I think that these times, one in Philadelphia and one in Toronto, and why they list them in Guten Jin time is out of respect and homage to this Carl Friedrich Gauss, and so that he can relate these measurements to the time where he is, right? Because you also have to remember that for the survey, there are these magnetic stations set up everywhere. These devices are there, and they put guys in front of them, and they say, every 2 minutes, tell me what the needle says. And so when they're recording it in Guten Jin time, I believe that's out of tribute to Carl Gauss here. So, I don't know, kind of interesting there. But of course, none of this tells me what the magnetic disturbance of May 6th was, right? None of it, right? And so I said, well, if the disturbance was so great that it drew all this attention, maybe there were some significant storms in the area around these days. And so I decided to hit up my regular source, the Baltimore Sun, and look at May 7th, 1834, to see if it talked about any storms. And wouldn't you know it, May 7th, 1843, not in the Baltimore Sun archives. Right? And so I was like, God, that's crazy, And so I did. I looked around May 6th and May 8th, and, they didn't really talk about any major storms or any major weird weather activity or anything that I found. And so I was like, well, geez, what else happened on May 6, 1834? And so I decided to Google that. And so let's take a look at what that brought me. And so the most interesting thing that I found that happened on May 6, 1843 was this. And that is Joseph Smith prophesied that the government would be overthrown and wasted. Right? It says that on May 6, 1843, Joseph Smith said, I prophesy in the name of the Lord God of Israel, unless the United States redress the wrongs committed upon the saints in the state of Missouri and punish the crimes committed by her officers, that in a few years the government will be utterly overthrown and wasted, and there will not be so much as a potsherd left for their wickedness in permitting the murder of men, women, and children, and the wholesale plunder and extermination of thousands of her citizens to go unpunished, thereby perpetrating a foul and corroding blot upon the fair fame of this great republic, the very thought of which would have caused the high-minded and patriotic framers of the constitutions of the United States to hide their faces with shame. Judge Stephen A. Douglas, you will aspire to the presidency of the United States, and if you ever turn your hand against me or the Latter-day Saints, you will feel the weight of the hand of the Almighty upon you, and you will live to see and know that I have testified the truth to you, for the conversation of this day will stick to you through life. And so what this article does is it goes on to talk about all the ways that this prophecy came true. And it's really an amazing read, and I'll try to leave a link for it. And so wrapping up this story of May 6, 1834, where the disturbance was first noticed in Philadelphia, and that this disturbance was also felt in Toronto. And remembering that, of course, that William Morgan did time in Toronto as a brewer before it burned to the ground and so forth. And so I wanted to take a look. What does that line between Philadelphia and Toronto look like? So I brought up Google Earth, right? And we have Philadelphia down here. We have Toronto up here. And I think it's interesting that it's 335.5 miles distance as the crow flies. And my line here making me think, that's not so far off from 336 now, is it? Right? But the amazing thing is where this line cuts through, which is, of course, Western New York here. And when we zoom in on it, we have Rochester up here, not that far. But here's Batavia. Look how close to the line Batavia is, right? And this is where William Morgan and his young bride took up permanent residence, where that same young bride, Lucinda Morgan, she marries George Harris. Now, 1843, when this happens, is of course well after William Morgan goes missing and after Joseph Smith Jr. starts the Mormon faith, and all of that happens in Indiana and Missouri and so forth. But that makes me think that if these magnetic disturbances were happening in 1843, maybe they were happening in, what's to say that they weren't happening in the 1820s, and that perhaps these magnetic disturbances could have something to do with Joseph Smith finding those golden plates and that codex and the breastplate and so forth somewhere in Palmyra near here, right? I don't know. But it's certainly something amazing to think about. And so anyway, this story has just been an unbelievably good time for me to tell, a good way to have fun with the lies, right? And so I hope you guys had as much fun with this one as I did. And so until the next one, cheers, guys.